The moment Naomi Redmond stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, 3 different men warned her about Silas Dawson before she had even taken the dust off her boots. It was the autumn of 1878, and the prairie wind came down from the north with a sharp, deliberate bite, carrying the smell of dry grass and horse sweat, and the particular kind of loneliness that settled over a frontier town when the summer trade had thinned, and the cattle drives were done for the season. Caldwell sat on the edge of everything, the last real town before the Cherokee Outlet opened into that vast, indifferent stretch of Oklahoma territory, and it wore that distinction the way a man wears a scar. Proudly and with a little too much awareness of it. Naomi was 24 years old and she carried a single carpetbag. She was not especially tall, but she stood as if she were, with straight shoulders and a level gaze that had been earned through years of managing a difficult life without the benefit of anyone doing it for her. Her hair was dark brown and she had pinned it up sensibly under a plain bonnet that had seen better years, and her dress was clean but faded at the hem, where the color had washed out from too many launderings. She was not arriving with money. She was not arriving with connections, or property, or letters of introduction from anyone of consequence. She had a small sum tucked into the lining of her bag, enough to last her perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful, and she had a piece of paper with a job advertisement written on it that she had clipped from a newspaper in Wichita. The advertisement had read, "Experienced cook and housekeeper wanted. Honest work. Fair wages. Inquire at Dawson Ranch 3 miles south of Caldwell, Kansas." Simple enough. Practical enough. The kind of work Naomi had been doing in one form or another since she was 15. The first warning came from the stagecoach driver himself, a heavy-set man named Pete who had deep-set eyes and the cautious manner of someone who had learned to be careful with information and was deciding whether to be careful now. "You heading out to the Dawson place?" he asked, after she had given him her bag to lift down. "I am," she said. He handed her the bag and looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite concern but lived somewhere between the two. "He won't keep you," he said. "He never keeps them. Had 4 housekeepers in 3 years and they all left inside of 2 months. Man doesn't talk, doesn't acknowledge you're there, acts like a thundercloud with legs. You seem like a nice enough woman. Might want to look into work at the hotel first." Naomi thanked him politely and walked into town. The second warning came from Mrs. Adeline Potts, who ran the dry goods store on the main street and who had apparently been waiting for the stagecoach in order to collect a bolt of fabric, and found herself in conversation with Naomi while they both waited for the coach driver to unload the luggage properly. Mrs. Potts was a small, energetic woman of about 50 with bright eyes and an absolute dedication to knowing everything about everyone in the surrounding county. "Silas Dawson," she said, when Naomi mentioned where she was headed. "Oh, honey. I've known that man since he was 19 years old, and I will tell you something honestly. He has never once let a woman get close to him. Not since his mother died, not since that business with Margaret Hale 6 years back, not for any reason anyone has ever been able to identify. He is not a cruel man, I want to be fair. He is not a brute, but he is so closed off it is like trying to have a conversation with a fence post. The women who have worked out there have all said the same thing. He doesn't look at you, doesn't speak to you unless it's about the work, doesn't eat at the same table. You could be invisible and he'd prefer it that way." Naomi asked carefully what had happened with Margaret Hale. Mrs. Potts pursed her lips. "Engagement that went badly. She left him or he pushed her away, depending on who you ask. Either way, he closed up after that and he has not opened back up. That was 6 years ago and he's been running that ranch alone with 2 hired hands ever since. 31 years old and living like a hermit with cattle." Naomi picked up her bag. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "But I still need the work." The third warning came from a man named Clem Hobart, who was sitting on the bench outside the saloon with his hat pulled down and a hand-rolled cigarette between his teeth, and who called out to her as she passed because he had, apparently, overheard some of her conversation with Mrs. Potts through the open door of the dry goods store. "You don't want to go out to Dawson," he called. "I'm telling you true. I worked for him for one season 2 years back. Man doesn't warm to nobody, especially not a woman. He'll have you feeling like a ghost in your own skin inside of a week." Naomi stopped walking. She looked at the man on the bench. She said, with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from having very few options and being fully at peace with that, "I didn't come here expecting warmth. I came here expecting wages." She hired a horse and a simple rig from the livery stable on the south end of town, a transaction that took 20 minutes and cost her more than she liked, and drove herself the 3 miles south through the flat, wide-open land where the buffalo grass had gone gold and the sky above was enormous and pale and streaked at the horizon with the faint pink of afternoon light. The land out here was something that required adjustment. It did not soften itself for you. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and you either found a way to exist within it or you did not. The Dawson Ranch appeared before her as a collection of low, practical buildings arranged without much sentiment around a central yard. There was a main house built from timber that had weathered to a silver gray over what looked like several decades, with a covered porch running along the front and windows that caught the fading light. There was a large barn with the red paint mostly stripped off by weather, a small bunkhouse, a smoke house, a root cellar set into the earth, a well, a chicken coop that needed repair on one side, and several corrals in which she could see horses and, at a distance, a good-sized herd of cattle moving slowly on the open grass. There were 2 men working near the barn when she drove up. One was young, maybe 18, with straw-colored hair, and the other was older with a dark mustache and a comfortable, unhurried way of moving. Both of them stopped what they were doing and watched her drive into the yard. The young one came over. "You the woman answering the advertisement?" he asked. "I am," she said. "My name is Naomi Redmond. I've come about the housekeeper position." The young man, whose name turned out to be Will Avery, tied her horse without being asked, which she noted favorably, and told her that Mr. Dawson was in the south field and would be back before dark. The older man with the mustache introduced himself as Hector Reyes, and he had the careful, assessing eyes of someone who had seen a lot of hired help come and go and had formed no particular attachment to any of them. "You know what you're coming into?" Hector asked her, not unkindly, just directly. "I have a general picture," she said. He nodded slowly, looking at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Kitchen is through the main door to the left. There's coffee on the stove. Been there since noon, so it's probably tar by now, but you're welcome to it. Mr. Dawson said to tell whoever came for the position to wait." She waited. The inside of the house was exactly what you would expect of a man living alone for years. It was not filthy. Silas Dawson was not a filthy man. She could tell that, but it had the particular blankness of a space that was used rather than lived in. Functional, clean enough, and completely empty of anything that might be called comfort or care. The kitchen was large and had a good iron stove and solid table, the kind of practical room that could be excellent with attention. The main room had a fireplace with ash in the grate and a chair, and a table with papers on it, and that was essentially all. No pictures on the walls, no curtains on the windows, no evidence that anyone had tried to make this place feel like a home rather than a shelter. Naomi set her bag down, took off her bonnet, and started cleaning the kitchen while she waited. She had scrubbed the table, cleaned the coffee pot, started a fresh pot of coffee, swept the floor, and begun organizing the dry goods shelf when she heard boots on the porch. The door opened, and Silas Dawson came in. He was taller than she had expected, with a lean, angular build that had been shaped by years of physical labor rather than deliberate effort. He was 31 and looked it honestly, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into strong, clean lines, dark stubble along his jaw, and dark brown hair that needed cutting. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that caught the lamplight in a way that was startling, and his expression when he saw her standing in his kitchen was one of such complete blankness that she understood immediately what Mrs. Potts had been trying to tell her. It was not hostility. It was something more complete than hostility. It was the expression of a man who had simply decided that other people did not require his engagement and had been living according to that decision for long enough that it had become his natural resting state. He looked at her, looked at the cleaned kitchen, looked back at her. "You're here about the position," he said. His voice was low and level and without inflection. "Naomi Redmond," she said. "Yes." He moved to the hook near the door and hung up his hat. He took a cup from the shelf and poured himself some of the fresh coffee she had made, looked at it for a moment as if noticing it was different, and said nothing about it. "Work is hard," he said, standing at the counter with the coffee and not looking at her directly. "House, cooking for 3 men, preserving in the fall, laundry twice a week, room and board, and $12 a month. $12 a month was reasonable. Not generous, but reasonable." "That's acceptable," she said. "Previous women found the arrangement disagreeable and left," he said. "I'm telling you in advance so you don't claim you weren't informed." "I'm not easily disagreed by arrangements," she said. He looked at her then briefly and directly, which seemed to cost him something. "The room is at the back of the house, small, has a window that faces east." "That's fine," she said. He picked up his coffee and walked out of the kitchen into the main room, and that was the end of their first conversation. Naomi stood in the cleaned kitchen for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, and then she began to figure out what was available to make dinner. The first weeks were exactly as described. Silas Dawson rose before dawn, was gone to the fields or the range before she had fully started breakfast, came in at the time she expected him, ate what she put in front of him without comment, and left again. He did not say good morning. He did not say thank you. He did not ask her about herself or volunteer anything about himself. He spoke to her about 3 times a week, and each time it was entirely functional. The wood supply needs topping up before winter. One of the horses needs looking after. Hector will get the medicine from town, just noting you'll see him coming and going more than usual. There's a leak in the roof above the back room. I'll fix it at the weekend. Put a bucket down until then. She put a bucket down. He fixed the roof at the weekend in the rain without complaint. She learned the rhythms of the house and fitted herself to them without friction, which was something she was good at. She cooked 3 solid meals a day. She kept the house clean. She mended what needed mending and organized what needed organizing. And in the evenings, after the dishes were done, she sat at the kitchen table by the lamp and read from the small collection of books she had brought in her carpetbag, or wrote letters to her older sister Clara, who lived in Missouri. She did not try to make Silas Dawson talk to her. She did not perform cheerfulness or manufacture conversation to fill the silence. She understood, in some deep and practical part of herself, that a man who had been inside walls for this long was not going to be coaxed out of them by someone trying hard. The trying hard was, she suspected, part of what had made previous women leave. You could exhaust yourself trying to get warmth from someone who wasn't offering it, and eventually that exhaustion became unbearable. She was not there for his warmth. She was there to work. And she worked, and she left him alone. Will Avery, who was 19 and enthusiastic about most things and lonely for company after spending long days at labor, became a pleasant fixture in her days. He ate in the kitchen every morning and evening, which Silas apparently allowed, and he talked while he ate in the good-natured way of a young man who had not yet learned to be guarded about himself. He had come from Missouri 2 years prior, was saving money to buy land of his own eventually, found ranching hard and satisfying in equal measure, and thought Silas Dawson was the most capable rancher in the county even if he was. And here Will lowered his voice to something approaching a whisper even though Silas was not in the house, approximately the most difficult man to work for that he had ever met. "He's fair," Will said, one morning in her second week, eating the biscuits she had made. "I want to say that. He's fair, and he never asks you to do something he wouldn't do himself, and he pays on time, which out here is not as common as you'd like." But he doesn't, I don't know how to say it. He doesn't let you feel like you're real to him. You do a good job and he says nothing. You do a bad job and he says nothing, but the way he looks at you, it's strange is what it is. Has he always been this way? She asked. Will considered. Hector says he was different when he was younger, more open, but something happened and then he wasn't anymore. Naomi thought about the story of Margaret Hale that Mrs. Potts had told her, but she did not repeat it to Will. It was not her story to repeat. What she noticed in those first weeks was small. The kind of thing you only caught if you were paying the right kind of attention, which Naomi did because she had learned to read rooms and people out of necessity. Small things like this. The first time she made biscuits from scratch, Silas reached for a second one slowly, with the deliberate casualness of a man who did not want it observed. The first time she left a piece of dried apple pie on the counter under a cloth, he ate it sometime in the early morning hours before anyone else was up, and she only knew because it was gone. The first week she organized the main room, just cleaned it properly and put the papers in a sensible order and scrubbed the fireplace around. She caught him standing in the doorway looking at it for a long moment before he walked in, and there was something in his face that she could not name, but that was not the blankness. She said nothing about any of it. She simply continued working. In her third week, she was out in the yard at first light hanging laundry on the line Hector had strung between two posts near the house, and Silas came out to work on something at the fence that ran along the near side of the first corral. He worked with his back to her. She worked with her back to him. The morning was cold and the sky was layered with clouds that were turning from gray to gold as the sun came up, and the prairie smelled of frost and dry earth. After about 20 minutes of this, Silas said, without turning around, "The coffee was better this morning." She kept pinning laundry. "I found some better beans in the store cupboard. There was a full tin at the back behind the cornmeal." Silence. "I didn't know they were there," he said. "They had been there a while," she said. "Still good, though." More silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. Just the kind of silence that falls when two people have said a thing and are resting in it. "There's a tin of molasses in the root cellar," he said after a while. "Top shelf on the left, if it's of use to you." "It would be," she said. "Thank you." He went back to working on the fence. She finished the laundry. That was the end of it, but she noted it anyway, the same way she noted the biscuit and the pie, and added it to the small, quiet account she was keeping of a man who was not as sealed as he appeared to be. It was Hector who told her the fuller version of things, 4 weeks after she arrived, on an evening when Will had gone into town, and Silas had ridden out to check on the south herd, and Naomi and Hector were in the yard together. She mending a harness strap he had brought her because he had observed that she was handy with leather work, and he smoking and watching the sunset. "You're lasting longer than the others," Hector said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation. "I'm not doing anything different than the others," she said. "You're doing something different," he said. "You're not pushing at him. The others pushed. They wanted him to be sociable, wanted him to notice them, wanted things from him that he wasn't able to give. You don't want anything from him." "I want my wages," she said. Hector smiled, which was a rare enough event that she noticed it. "He's a good man," he said eventually, with the slow weight of someone saying something he believed entirely. "I've worked for him 8 years. People in town think he's cold, but that's not right. He's afraid. He learned to be afraid of opening himself to people, and now it's all he knows. His father was not a gentle man, and Margaret Hale, you know about Margaret." "A little," she said. "She was engaged to him, and she left him for a man in Wichita who had more money and better prospects, and she was not wrong to want those things. But she handled it very badly, and she said things to him that, they cut deep. That a man who did not know how to love a woman had no business asking a woman to stay with him. Words like that. He was 25 and he'd put his whole self into that engagement, and she took those words and she threw them at him and they stuck." Naomi kept her eyes on the harness and said nothing. "He hasn't tried since," Hector said. "Not with anyone. Sold off the old house and built this one farther out, hired on, worked, and that's been his life." He's 31 and he has a good ranch and nothing else. The prairie was going dark around them and the first stars were appearing. He told me once, Hector said, very quietly, after a long day and more whiskey than was wise, that he didn't know how to be the kind of man a woman could want. That he'd tried and been found wanting and he supposed that was just how it was. Hector tapped ash from his cigarette. A man who believes that about himself, you're not going to talk him out of it. It has to happen some other way. Naomi set down the mended harness and looked at the darkening sky. I'm not trying to fix him, she said. No, said Hector. That's why you're still here. November came in cold and fast, the way it did on the Kansas prairie, with north winds that cut straight through and mornings so cold the water in the bucket near the door had a skin of ice on it. Naomi adapted. She banked the fires better and earlier. She made heartier food. She added dried herbs from the kitchen garden she had slowly cultivated in the weeks prior to the cold, small bunches of sage and thyme that she hung from the kitchen ceiling, and that gave the house a particular scent that was the opposite of its previous blankness. It was in the first week of November that the first thing happened that genuinely surprised her. She had been outside collecting eggs from the repaired chicken coop. She had fixed the broken side herself over 2 afternoons with wood from the barn, and Silas had seen it done and said nothing. And she had misjudged the ice on the path between the coop and the house and gone down hard on her left knee and her right hand, scattering eggs and dropping the basket. She had sat there for a moment assessing the damage, which was a badly scraped palm and a bruised knee, and was pushing herself up when she heard boots on the frozen ground. Silas Dawson came around the corner of the house at what was, for him, something approaching a hurry. He had seen her fall from the corral, apparently. He stopped a few feet from her with a look on his face that was entirely different from his habitual blankness, a look of direct, unconcealed concern that was there before he could think to remove it. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Clumsy. The ice." He reached down and took her right hand without asking and looked at the scraped palm, and he did this with such matter-of-fact directness that she did not have time to be surprised until it was already happening. His hands were very warm from work, and there was a calloused roughness to them that was familiar in the way of hands that had always known labor. He looked at the scrape, turned her hand over once, and then let it go. "Come inside," he said. "There's iodine in the cabinet above the sink." She gathered the unbroken eggs. 3 of the 5 had survived and followed him in. He found the iodine and he set it on the table, and he stood there for a moment in the way of a man who is trying to decide whether to offer something or to leave the room. She could see the decision happening on his face, which was unusual because usually his face gave nothing away. "Can you do it yourself or do you want help?" he asked. The question was so stripped down, so carefully without any warmth or softness, that it paradoxically contained both of those things. It was the question of a man trying very hard not to be tender who was being tender anyway. "I can manage," she said, "but thank you for asking." He nodded once and left the kitchen. She sat at the table with the iodine in her scraped hand and she thought, there it is, exactly. After that things shifted in the smallest possible increments, so small that if you were watching from outside you might not have seen them at all. But Naomi felt each one with the precision of someone who had learned to notice small things, because small things were often all you got. He started eating breakfast in the kitchen. Not immediately, not the next morning, but about a week after the ice incident, he came in at the time she usually had things ready and sat down at the table without being invited, ate without speaking, and left. She said good morning and he said good morning back, which was not nothing. She found small things that needed doing in the mornings before he left and she did them without announcement or expectation, and after the 3rd or 4th time he looked up from what he was doing with that direct gray-green look and said, "You don't have to do that. That's not your work." "I know," she said. "I was passing and it needed doing." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "The fence post on the east side of the garden has been loose for 2 months. If you want I can fix it this weekend, make the garden easier to work in spring. That would be very useful, she said. He fixed the fence post. She had not been asking him to fix it. She had not been asking for anything at all, but he fixed it anyway. It was around this time that she began to notice something else, that Silas Dawson read. Not that he tried to hide it, but she learned it quietly, the way you learn things about a person in a small house. There were books in the main room, wedged on the shelf above the fireplace, and she had thought them decorative or inherited until one evening she came through from the kitchen and found him sitting in the chair by the fire with a book open, reading with his full attention in the way of someone who genuinely loved it. He heard her and looked up, and the expression on his face was the expression of a person caught being more fully themselves than they intended. A brief openness followed by the familiar shutting down. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "You didn't," he said. She went past him to get something from the other side of the room, and on the way back she looked at the book because she couldn't help herself and saw it was George Eliot Middlemarch, which she had read twice and had felt, both times, like having a long conversation with someone who understood the world more precisely than she did. She stopped, not meaning to, and said without thinking, "That's a beautiful book." He looked up. She felt slightly embarrassed for having said it without thinking in that direct, unguarded way. "I've read it twice," she said. "I love the part where Dorothea realizes what she's been settling for. It feels true." Silas looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "I'm in the second half," he said. "I've read it once before. I wanted to read it again." "It's better the second time," she said. "You catch things you missed." She went to the kitchen. She heard him turn a page. That evening after dinner, when she was back at the kitchen table with her own book and the house was quiet, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the George Eliot book in his hand. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then he said, "There's no reason you should have to sit in here. The main room has better light." She looked at him. "The lamp by the chair is good quality," he said. "Better for reading." "I'm fine in here," she said. "I know you're fine in here," he said, and she could hear the effort in his voice, the way of a man pushing against something heavy and finding it harder than expected. "I'm saying you're welcome in the main room if you want." She considered this for a moment with the care it deserved. "Thank you," she said. "Perhaps tomorrow evening." He nodded and went back to the main room, and after a while she heard him reading again in the particular silence of a person who has found their way back into a story. December brought snow, and snow changed the ranch in the way that it changed everything on the plains. It simplified things and made them harder simultaneously. The world shrank to what was immediate and necessary. Keeping the animals alive, keeping the fires going, keeping the roads passable enough to get to town when necessary. The 3 hired men who came in for the cattle season had long since moved on, and it was just Naomi, Silas, Will, and Hector through the long cold, living in close proximity in the way of people who have learned to tolerate each other's edges. She began sitting in the main room in the evenings. Not every night, but several nights a week, in the chair across from his by the fire reading. He read on his side, she read on hers, and they did not always speak, but occasionally one of them would say something about the thing they were reading and the other would respond, and it was remarkable how much could pass between 2 people in those small exchanges. She learned that he had strong opinions about Thoreau which she found amusing and told him so, and he looked at her with something that was almost dangerously close to the beginning of a smile. She learned that he had grown up on this land, that his father had built the original structure before Silas had rebuilt it, that he had 2 years of formal education, and had taught himself everything else from books, that he had an absolute faith in the practical value of good land properly tended, and that he was afraid, as people who love a place are always afraid, of things going wrong with it. She told him, because he was clearly a man who found direct questions difficult but had no defenses against direct information that was simply offered, that she had grown up in Ohio, that her parents had both died when she was 17, that she had lived with her older sister's family for 2 years before it became clear that she needed her own income and her own situation, that she had worked as a cook in 2 different households in Wichita before seeing his advertisement. She did not tell it as a sad story, because she did not experience it as a sad story. It was simply what had happened, and what had happened had brought her here, and here was neither bad nor good yet, but it was honest, and she valued honest above almost everything. He listened to all of this without speaking. She finished, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "You've managed a great deal alone." "Most people have to," she said. "Some people get more help than others," he said. It was not a complaint. It was an observation made by a man who had thought carefully about the fairness of things. "Yes," she said, "they do." The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind drove snow against the windows. "I was sorry to hear about your parents," he said, in the careful, measured way of a man who did not say such things often and was making sure he did it properly when he did. "Thank you," she said. They went back to their books, but the room felt different, smaller and warmer and more present than it had felt before. Christmas came, and she had no particular expectation of it. She made a proper Christmas dinner because she had the ingredients and the time, and because feeding people well was one of the ways she knew how to care for them. A roasted chicken because a turkey was not to be had, sweet potatoes from the root cellar, pickled beets, cornbread, and a dried apple cake that made the kitchen smell like something from a different kind of life. Will and Hector ate at the table with her in the kitchen, as they usually did. She had set the table with a cloth and put a small arrangement of dried flowers in the center, because she had dried them from the autumn garden and they were there, and it seemed right. Will was moved by this in the transparent way of a very young man far from his family, and Hector nodded at the table setting with quiet approval. Silas came in for dinner, as he usually did, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the table. He stood there for a moment the same way he had stood in the doorway of the main room the time she had read there, that look of something being slightly more than expected. He sat down at the table. She had set 4 places, as she had been setting 4 places for 2 weeks now, because it made no sense for him to eat separately, and she had simply started setting the table for 4 without comment, and after 3 days of not using the place she set, he had begun using it without either of them acknowledging the change. He looked at the dried apple cake when she set it on the table, and he said, "You went to trouble." "It's Christmas," she said. "Trouble is appropriate." There was a pause in which Will was looking between the two of them with the poorly disguised interest of someone watching something he could not quite identify. "Well," said Silas, "it looks fine." Coming from him at this stage, that was a speech. After dinner, Hector produced a bottle of whiskey, and Will Avery played the harmonica. Better than you would expect, actually better, with a sweet, clear tone that filled the kitchen and went some way toward filling the quiet, and Naomi washed the dishes and listened to the music and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was glad she had come here. Not because anything remarkable was happening. Just because it was honest, and it was real, and there was something growing in this plain, weather-beaten house that had not been here before. She turned from the sink, and Silas was leaning against the kitchen wall with a glass of Hector's whiskey, and he was watching her, not with the flat blankness she had grown accustomed to, but with something different, something that looked like a man paying careful attention because what he was looking at mattered to him. He looked away when she caught him, in the practiced way of a man who had spent years not being caught. But she had seen it. January was bitter and isolating in the way that Kansas January could be, the kind of cold that did not negotiate. And there were 3 days in the middle of the month when a blizzard hit and the world outside the windows was simply white and loud and impenetrable. And the 3 buildings of the ranch house, barn and bunkhouse, became their entire world. During the blizzard, Will and Hector stayed in the bunkhouse as they usually did, and Silas and Naomi were alone in the main house for 3 days. It was not scandalous by the standards of necessity. When the weather confined you, you were confined, and that was simply how it was, but it was the longest unbroken stretch of time she had spent in his company, and things emerged from it that would not have emerged otherwise. On the first evening of the storm, after she had made dinner and the wind was howling at every wall, she sat in the main room by the fire with her book, and he sat across from her with his. And at some point she looked up, and he was not reading but watching the fire with an expression of such unguarded heaviness that her heart did something unexpected. "What are you thinking about?" she asked before she decided whether to ask or not. He looked at her and the expression did not close all the way. "The North heard," he said, "whether the windbreak is holding." "Hector said it was solid," she said. "It is," he said. "I know it is. I built it solid." He turned the book over in his hands. "It's something I do, worry about things that are solid, build things to be solid and then worry about them anyway." She thought about that. "Is that how you've always been?" He was quiet for a while, and she thought he was going to redirect the conversation the way he usually did, but instead he said, "My father built the original house badly. Good piece of land, good location, and he built the house badly in the first hard winter. We spent 2 months trying to keep warm in a house that was falling in on itself. I was 9, and I decided I decided that things I built would be solid." "That's sensible," she said. "It became excessive," he said very evenly. "I applied it to everything. Built things to be solid and then didn't trust that they were solid and then built walls that were too solid to see through." He stopped. He looked at the fire. "I'm aware of that." "Are you?" she said. "I am," he said. "I've been aware of it for years. Being aware of a thing doesn't make it easy to stop." She looked at him across the fire and he looked back at her, and it was the most direct thing he had ever said to her, and she understood that it had cost him something. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that caught the firelight and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the wind drove itself against the house, and the fire crackled, and the world outside was white and impassable. The next day he came in from checking on the animals. He had done it 3 times because he was a man who could not help it, and she had made soup from the last of the stored vegetables and cornbread, and she set it on the table and he sat down and then, in what was for Silas Dawson a sudden and unprecedented action, he said, "Tell me more about Ohio." She looked up. "You mentioned growing up there," he said, looking at the soup. "I've never been east of Topeka." And she told him about Ohio, about the small town near Columbus where she had grown up, about her parents who had been kind and hardworking, and had died too young within 6 months of each other, about her sister Clara, who was married to a good man named Robert, and had 3 children now, and sent letters that were full of the good, detailed life of a person who had found her footing. She told him about learning to cook from her mother, about how she had always been good with her hands, about the particular loneliness of leaving a place you knew for a place you didn't. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "Why Kansas? Why this far west?" "Because," she said, thinking about it honestly, "I wanted something that was mine, something I chose, not a family arrangement or a charity situation or a city job where you're invisible and replaceable. I wanted to be somewhere where the work was real and the space was real and you could see the distance." She paused. "That probably sounds strange." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He looked at her across the table with an expression that was the furthest thing from the blankness she had arrived to, an expression that was careful and searching, and full of something that had not been there before, and she felt the warmth of it with a kind of shock, because she had not been expecting it and had not been trying for it, and that made it more real and more alarming than anything she had anticipated. By the end of the 3 days of the blizzard, they had talked more than they had talked in the previous 3 months combined. Not dramatically, not with declarations or confessions or the kinds of emotional confrontations that she suspected Silas Dawson would have locked himself in the barn to avoid, but in the simple, incremental, daily way of 2 people who are becoming known to each other. He showed her the ranch ledgers because she mentioned that she had kept accounts in Wichita, and he was behind on the winter figures. And they sat at the table together going through the numbers, and she noticed the way he thought about the ranch, not just as property but as a living thing, as a commitment and a responsibility, a thing he tended with the focused love of a person who had decided that land was safer to love than people. She said something to this effect obliquely, and he looked at her sideways and said, "That's a perceptive thing to say." "I pay attention," she said. "I've noticed," he said. The blizzard ended. The world opened up again, white and clean and freezing, and Will and Hector came over for breakfast, and the regular daily rhythms reasserted themselves. But something had shifted that did not unshift, and they both knew it. What happened in February surprised him more than it surprised her, she thought, because she had been watching for it while he had been, if anything, watching in the opposite direction, which is a thing people do when something is coming toward them that they don't trust themselves to want. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-February, and she was in the kitchen garden still frozen and bare, but she was planning it, sketching out where she wanted things to go in spring, because it gave her pleasure to plan, and because the garden was entirely hers and she was going to do it properly this year. Silas came around the back of the house on his way from somewhere to somewhere and stopped. "Planning the garden," he said. "Trying to work out where to put the beans," she said. "And whether there's enough sun on the east side for tomatoes." He came and stood beside her and looked at the garden, and then, without anything that particularly announced itself as significant, he began talking about crop placement with the same practical knowledge he applied to everything. And she listened and argued at one point because she thought he was wrong about the bean placement and she was right. And he considered her argument and said, with the particular expression of a man who is finding being wrong unexpectedly enjoyable, "That might work better." Yes. They stood there in the cold February sun for nearly an hour, planning a vegetable garden together. At one point she turned to say something and found that he was standing very close, closer than she had expected, and for a long suspended moment neither of them moved. She could see the detail of his face clearly in the winter light, the line of his jaw, the way the cold had put color into his cheeks, the look in those gray-green eyes that was not the look of a man who did not warm to women. It was the look of a man who had forgotten, temporarily, that he was supposed not to. He stepped back. He looked at the bare ground. He said in a careful, measured voice, "The fence post I fixed in the fall held through the winter should be solid for spring." "I noticed," she said. "You did a good job." He nodded and went on his way, and she stood in the garden for another minute looking at the pale winter sky and thinking that she would have to be very careful not to let herself want something that might not be safe to want. The problem with that resolution was that wanting is not always a thing you choose. She had not come to the Dawson ranch bringing anything except her labor and her willingness to work and her own quiet self. She had not brought beauty tricks or social graces or the soft, calculated skills that women of the era were sometimes advised to deploy in order to secure situations, matrimonial or otherwise. She had brought nothing except herself, which was exactly the point. She had brought nothing particular, and he had warmed to her anyway, slowly and reluctantly, and then all at once, which is the way warming happens when it happens to people who don't intend it. In March, when the first warmth began to break through, and the prairie started showing its first tentative green, Hector's wife Rosa came to stay for 2 weeks while Hector dealt with a complicated family situation that required his absence and could not be managed quickly. Rosa Reyes was 45 and magnificent, with dark hair going silver and an absolute comfortable authority in any room she entered, and she took one look at the situation at the Dawson Ranch and said, within 48 hours and entirely privately to Naomi while they were making bread, "That man is in love with you." "He is not," Naomi said. "I have known Silas Dawson for 8 years, Rosa said, pressing the bread dough with practiced hands. "I have never seen him bring coffee to a woman. I have never seen him sit at the same table for dinner of his own accord. I have never seen him watch someone the way he watches you when he thinks you're not looking. He is in love with you and he is terrified of it." Naomi was quiet. "What are you going to do about it?" Rosa asked. "Nothing," Naomi said. Rosa looked at her for a long moment with the clear eyes of a woman who had no patience for false simplicity. "Nothing is still a choice," she said. "I know," Naomi said, But I didn't come here for that, and I'm not going to. I don't want to push at him. You know what he's like when someone pushes." "I know what he's like when someone pushes," Rosa agreed. "But I also know there is a difference between pushing and being willing." She dusted flour from her hands. "He needs to know you're willing, Naomi. Not pushing, just willing." Naomi thought about this for a long time. It was April. The ranch was coming alive again. Calves arriving. The garden she and Silas had planned together going into the ground. The days lengthening with that particular prairie generosity that made you forgive the winter completely. When Silas Dawson did the thing that changed things finally and completely. She had been in the garden in the late afternoon, planting the beans in the configuration they had agreed upon in February, and she had come in to find that he had repaired the kitchen shelf that had been slightly loose since winter, a thing she had not asked about, had not mentioned, had not known he had noticed, and that he had left a small bunch of early wildflowers on the kitchen table in a tin cup with water in it. There was no note. Of course there was no note. He was not a man who left notes. She stood looking at the wildflowers for a long time. Small purple flowers, the early spring kind that came up on the south slopes before anything else, and he had been working that direction in the morning. When he came in for dinner, she said, keeping her voice ordinary, "The shelf is much better, and the flowers are lovely." He sat down at the table and did not look at her directly but looked at the flowers in the tin cup as though checking on something. "They were coming up on the south hill," he said. "I know what they are," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her then, and she let him look, and she did not look away or change her expression or make it easier for him by giving him a reason to look away first. She just looked back at him, steady and open, and let him see that she was seeing him. The silence stretched and was not uncomfortable at all. "Naomi," he said. Her name, just her name, the first time he had used it since the first day, and the way he said it was different from the way you say someone's name when it is just a name. "Yes," she said. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He turned his hat in his hands. He had come in with his hat in his hands, and she noted this because he did not usually take his hat off before sitting down. He took a breath that was visible. "I know I'm not," he began, and stopped. "Silas," she said gently, and something in the way she said his name stopped him from what she could see was going to be a complete and well-intentioned dismantling of whatever he was trying to say. "Whatever you're about to qualify, I'd rather you didn't." He looked at her. "I've been here 7 months, she said. "I think I know what kind of man you are." She kept her voice even and honest, not romantic, not pushed, just honest. "I'm not expecting you to be different than you are. I'm just here." He was very still. "I don't have a great deal to offer," he said, eventually, in a voice that was stripped of its usual control and was therefore true. "I know that. I have the land and the work, and I'm not easy to be with. I know that too." "You've been very easy to be with," she said. "That might surprise you, but it's true." He looked at her with an expression so nakedly startled that she almost laughed. "You have," she said. "You've been quiet and fair, and occasionally you've fixed things I didn't ask you to fix and left flowers without a note, and that is more than a great many people manage." His mouth curved very slightly, which on Silas Dawson was the equivalent of another man grinning. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that." "Nobody knows how to do this," she said. "You just do it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, with the careful precision of a man laying something important down where it can be seen and assessed, "I'd like, if it's something you'd want, to call on you properly. I know that's given that you live in my house, that's somewhat backwards, but I'd like it to be proper." She felt warmth move through her from somewhere in the center of her chest. "I think that would be very fine," she said. He nodded once, with the expression of a man who has put down something heavy and does not quite know what to do with his newly empty hands. He called on her properly, which, given the nature of the situation, meant that Hector very graciously agreed to play the part of available chaperone, and that Silas began a courtship that was unlike anything she imagined it would be when she thought about it, which was to say, it was exactly like him. He did not bring extravagant gifts or make theatrical gestures. He brought her wildflowers when he was on the South Hill, which became a regular occurrence as spring deepened. He asked if she would like to ride out with him on Sunday afternoons to see the ranch properly, and she said yes, and they rode for hours across the wide green land in the particular companionship of two people who are becoming genuinely comfortable with each other. He talked more than she had ever heard him talk, not about feelings exactly, but about things. The land, the cattle, the history of the territory, things he had read and thought about, things he wanted to do with the South pasture, what he thought would happen as the territory opened up and more settlers came. And she talked back, which was the thing, the real thing, not the flowers or the mended shelf, but the fact that he listened to her as though she were saying important things, as though her opinions and perceptions were exactly as valuable as his own, which in her experience was not the most common quality in a man of this time and place, and she appreciated it absolutely. One afternoon in May, riding back from the river along the western edge of the property with the late sun turning the grass to gold, he stopped his horse, and she stopped hers, and he said, looking at the land and not at her, "My father told me once that a man who shows too much feeling makes himself weak." I believed that for a long time. She waited. He turned to look at her, and the evening light was on his face, and she thought with the kind of thought that comes from somewhere you don't usually look that he was the most handsome man she had ever seen, not in a way that had anything to do with the surface of things, but in the way that a person can be beautiful when they are being fully, unguardedly themselves. "I don't believe it anymore," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "I'm glad," she said. He reached over across the space between their horses and took her hand, which was the first time he had deliberately taken her hand, and he held it in his warm, calloused grip, and they sat there on the hill in the golden evening light with the wind moving through the grass and the cattle quiet in the distance. And it was one of those moments that you know while it is happening that it will stay with you for the rest of your life. He asked her to marry him in June, in the vegetable garden she had planted according to their plan, on a morning when the beans were coming up in exactly the place she had argued for in February, and the tomatoes on the east side had proved her right about the sun. He did it with the seriousness and the honesty with which he did everything, looking at her directly, holding her hands, saying, "I know I was not what anyone would have pointed you toward when you arrived. I know I'm not, I've been told what I am, and I believed it for a long time. But I would like to spend my life with you, Naomi, if you'll have me. I believe we'd be something good together." She looked at him in the morning light, in the vegetable garden he had helped her plan, on the ranch that had become in 7 months more of a home than any place she had been since Ohio, and she thought of every small piece of evidence she had collected from the very beginning. The second biscuit, the apple pie eaten in the early morning, the wildflowers in the tin cup, the coffee observation, the mended shelf, the garden fence post, and the way he had looked at her across the fire during the blizzard, and the way he had said her name in April, and the way he had taken her hand on the hill in May. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." His face did something magnificent. They were married in September of 1879, 1 year almost to the day after she had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with a carpetbag and 3 warnings. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, performed by a minister who came down from Wichita 3 times a year, and attended by Will Avery and Hector and Rosa Reyes and Mrs. Adeline Potts, who cried with the enthusiasm of someone whose investment in the outcome was significant and who had no intention of pretending otherwise. Naomi wore a dress that Rosa had helped her make from fabric ordered from a dry goods catalog, a deep blue-gray that Rosa said exactly suited her coloring, and she carried a bunch of the small purple wildflowers from the South Hill because they were still blooming in the September warmth, and because it seemed right. Silas stood at the front of the church in his best coat with his hat in his hands, and when she came up the aisle he looked at her with an expression so entirely unguarded that Mrs. Potts, sitting in the front pew, pressed her handkerchief to her eyes immediately, and Hector put a quiet hand on her shoulder. They said their vows with the simple directness that suited them both, looking at each other, meaning every word with the weight of people who had arrived at this point by a long and honest road. When it was done and they were standing outside in the September sunshine with the wind warm and the prairie wide around them, and the whole rest of their lives organized pleasantly in front of them, Pete, the stagecoach driver, who had come to town for a regular run and had heard about the wedding and stopped to see it, came over with his hat in his hand and said, "Well, I'll be damned if I wasn't wrong." "You were wrong," Naomi agreed pleasantly. "I was," he said, looking at Silas with something between respect and bewilderment. "How did she do it?" Silas put his hand at the small of Naomi's back, which was a gesture so natural that it was clear it had been happening for months already, and he said, "She didn't do anything in particular. She was just here." Pete looked back and forth between them and shook his head in the wondering way of a man revising a long-held belief about the nature of people. "Well," he said again, "I'll be." The first winter of their marriage was different from the previous one, which Naomi noticed with a private pleasure, because everything was the same and everything was different in the way that changes when the context of a thing shifts completely. The same house, the same cold, the same fire and the same grate, the same enormous Kansas sky pressing down on the same flat, wide land. But the walls had been painted softly, because she had wanted it and he had helped on a Saturday in October, and there were curtains on the windows because she had made them from cloth she had saved for, and there were pictures on the walls, a painted print from a Wichita shop that showed a mountain scene she had always found beautiful and that he had bought for her birthday in August, presenting it with the careful off-handedness of a man trying not to make too much of a gift that he had in fact thought about considerably. He talked more now, in the consistent, ongoing way of a man who had discovered that talking did not cost him what he had been afraid it would cost him, and that silence, while still his natural state, was chosen rather than compelled. He told her things she had not known about his years alone on the ranch, about the difficulty of the work in bad seasons, about the 2 winters when he had nearly lost the herd, about the way he had rebuilt the house in the year before she came because the old one had become unbearable in a way he had not wanted to examine. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 17, and who had been, from his account, a quiet and strong woman who had loved this land, and passed that love to him along with the practical knowledge of how to tend it. He told her about Margaret Hale finally directly on an evening in November, and he told it in his characteristic stripped-down way that contained more feeling than its surface suggested, and she listened without judgment and without particular comment except to say at the end, she was wrong about what she said. Whatever her reasons for leaving, she was wrong about that. He looked at her. "You know how to love a woman," she said. "I can tell you precisely how if you need the evidence." His mouth curved in that way that was still, even now, one of the most satisfying things she had ever seen. "I might need the evidence," he said. "The biscuits," she said. "The second biscuit on the first morning and the apple pie." He looked at her with widened eyes. "I was paying attention from the beginning," she said. "Every single thing," he laughed. Not loudly, not showily, but genuinely. And the sound of it in the warm lamplit room was the most complete confirmation of everything she had always believed was in there, waiting. By the following spring she was expecting their first child, a fact she told him one morning in March while they were both in the kitchen, a fact that produced an expression on his face that she could only describe as a man discovering that the solid things he had built were in fact holding. He took her hands. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He nodded, and then he nodded again, and she could see him working through something internally. "The bunkhouse roof needs fixing before summer," he said, "and I've been thinking about extending the kitchen." "If we were to add another room off the back, Silas," she said. "Yes." "You can say it," she said. "Whatever you want to say." He looked at her. "I am so glad you came here," he said very directly without any of the usual scaffolding. "I need you to know that." She squeezed his hands. "I'm glad I came too," she said. He kissed her forehead, which was the first thing he had done every morning for 6 months, in the reliable, tender way of a man who has found the right routine and has no intention of varying it. And then he went to start his day, and she stood in the kitchen in the March morning light and felt, with a completeness she had not always been sure of, that everything was exactly where it was meant to be. Their son was born in November of 1880, in the main room of the house, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell on a night when the first snow of the season was just beginning to fall. He was born loud and healthy, and with dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and Silas held him with the careful intensity of a man who has decided that the thing in his arms is the most important thing he has ever been responsible for, which was saying something for a man who took responsibility as seriously as Silas Dawson. They named him James, after nobody in particular, just because it was a name that felt solid and honest, which were the qualities they valued. Will Avery, who at 21 had become as close to family as a man not related by blood could be, was the first to hold James after his parents and declared him, with the absolute certainty of someone with no comparative experience, to be the finest baby in Kansas. Hector and Rosa sent a blanket that Rosa had made herself from wool she had been saving, and Mrs. Potts arrived 2 days later with a basket of food, and spent the afternoon being thoroughly useful in the practical way of women who know what new parents actually need. Silas sat in the chair by the fire with James against his chest, and a look on his face that was entirely without defense or distance or any of the careful protections he had lived behind for years. And Naomi sat nearby in the warmth of the fire, and the house that now had curtains and pictures, and the smell of good food and old wood, and the quiet sounds of her family. And she thought about the stagecoach driver and Mrs. Potts and Clem Hobart, and what they had all told her before she had even taken the dust from her boots. She thought about what she had brought when she came here: a carpetbag, a job advertisement, her own 2 hands, and nothing else in particular. She had not brought beauty or wealth or any calculated strategy of softening a difficult man. She had not brought performance. She had not pushed or coaxed or tried to fix or manage. She had brought herself, plainly and honestly, and gone to work, and paid attention and spoken directly, and given the man across the fire enough space and enough time and enough real, undemanding presence that he had found his own way back to himself. That was all it had been, and it had been enough, more than enough. In the spring of 1882, when James was 15 months old and pulling himself up on everything and examining the world with his father's particular serious attention, Naomi told Silas she was expecting again. He was better at the telling by this time, which is to say he said immediately, "I'm so glad. That's wonderful," and kissed her in a way that had nothing of the careful, qualified quality of a man who did not know how to love a woman. Their second child was a girl, born in October, small and fierce from the first breath, and they named her Clara after Naomi's sister in Missouri, who came to visit the following spring and cried when she saw the ranch and the life and the man her sister had made, not from sadness, but from the full, grateful recognition of a thing that had worked out in the very best possible way. Clara Redmond, now Clara Whitman, stood on the porch of the ranch house in the May morning with her arm around Naomi and looked out at the prairie and said, "When you wrote to me about him in those first months, I was so worried about you." "I know," Naomi said. "You said he barely spoke to you. You said he was like a wall." "He was," Naomi said, "for a while." Clara looked at her sister. What changed? Naomi thought about it with honest attention. She thought about the second biscuit and the apple pie and the coffee observation and the garden fence post and the wildflowers in a tin cup and her name said a certain way in April. "I didn't change," she said. "I just stayed and was honest. And stopped expecting him to be different than he was and found out that who he actually was worth staying for." She looked out at the land, green in the May sun, and he came the rest of the way himself. Clara considered this for a moment and then said, "That sounds very simple." "Most real things are," Naomi said. Silas came around the corner of the house with James on his shoulders, James with his dark hair and his serious eyes already showing the expression of a boy who was going to think carefully about things before he committed to an opinion, which was his father in miniature. Silas was laughing at something James had said. James, at 15 months, had several emphatic opinions about farm animals and expressed them loudly, and the sound of it crossed the yard and reached the porch, and Clara Whitman pressed her hand to her mouth and said quietly, "Oh, Naomi." "Yes," said Naomi. "You told me in your letters that he never laughed," Clara said. "He does now," Naomi said. He came up to the porch and swung James down from his shoulders and deposited him carefully on the porch boards, where James immediately went to investigate Clara Whitman's skirt hem with the interest of a small person who had decided she was the most interesting new arrival in his world. Silas looked at Naomi with the direct, easy warmth that had become the daily currency of their life together and said, "There's a good flat piece of land on the south side that would suit for Clara and Robert if they ever want to build. I talked to Hector about it. If they wanted to come west, the land's there." Clara looked between them. "Are you serious?" "The territory's opening up," Silas said, with the practicality of a man who thought about land the way other men thought about weather. "Good time to stake a claim, and James needs family around him." It was, Naomi thought, exactly what he would do. Not a romantic declaration, not a flowery speech, just a practical solution to a thing that mattered, offered because the people who mattered to her mattered to him, because that was the nature of loving someone. Their people became your people. She took his hand and he looked down at their joined hands, and then back at her with a look that was entirely unguarded and entirely, permanently warm. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because life on the Kansas frontier in the 1880s was not without difficulty, and Naomi had never been a woman who expected things to be easier than they were. There were bad seasons and good ones, years when the cattle market was low and the calculations were hard, and years when the grass was high and the herd thrived and the accounts added up in comfortable columns. There were the hard adjustments that came with 2 children and then a third, another boy, born in 1884, who they named Henry and who was from his first days the most sociable person on the ranch, already charming everyone in a 5-mile radius by the time he was 2. Well, Avery saved enough money and bought his land in 1883 and started his own small ranch 8 miles to the northwest. And they were his nearest neighbors and his best friends, and it was quietly satisfying to watch the young man who had talked at her kitchen table every morning for 2 years grow into a capable and contented man on his own piece of the prairie. Hector and Rosa remained, Hector managing the expanded operation as the ranch grew in those prosperous years, Rosa becoming as essential a part of Naomi's life as her sister, the kind of friendship that forms between women who see each other honestly and find what they see to be worth respecting entirely. Mrs. Potts came to every birthday party for every Dawson child and was each time the most enthusiastic person in attendance, which was saying something given the energy James and Henry brought to any gathering they attended. And through all of it, through the seasons and the work and the children and the gradual transformation of the spare and blankly silent house into something full of life and noise and color, and the accumulated evidence of a family that was genuinely, solidly there, Silas Dawson was exactly who he had always been underneath the walls he had built. Careful, fair, honest, steady as the land he tended, and this was the part that had been in there all along, waiting for the right conditions to emerge deeply, consistently, unreservedly loving. He showed it in the way he showed everything, in the practical and reliable way of a man who says things once and means them permanently. He came in from the fields and found her in the garden and stopped to talk before he went to clean up, every evening, without exception. He read to the children at night with the same full attention he brought to his own reading, sitting in the chair by the fire with James on one side and eventually Henry on the other, and small Clara on his lap, reading whatever they wanted with a patience that surprised her every time, because it was such a complete expression of who he actually was, as opposed to who people had decided he must be. He brought her wildflowers from the South Hill in every spring and summer that followed, not just in the courtship year, but every year reliably, the way some men bring home their wage, and some men bring home trouble, and this man brought wildflowers. And she put them in the tin cup on the kitchen table and thought each time of the first time, the cup without a note, the man who could not say yet what he was saying but said it anyway in the language available to him. One evening in the fall of 1885, when James was almost 5 and Henry was a year old and Clara was 3, and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that exists in a house full of sleeping children, which is a full and warm quiet very different from any other kind. Naomi was sitting by the fire with her mending and Silas was reading, and the fire was low and good, and the lamp was burning steadily, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Silas set his book down and looked at her, in the way he looked at her when he was about to say something considered, something that had been sitting with him for a while. "Do you remember what you said to Clem Hobart?" he asked. "When you arrived, when he warned you about me." She looked up from the mending. "How do you know what I said to Clem Hobart?" "He told me," Silas said. "Eventually, he said you told him you hadn't come expecting warmth, you'd come expecting wages." She felt a smile move across her face. "That's true," she said. "That's what I said. I've thought about it often," he said, "since he told me. I've thought about the fact that you came here with no expectations of anything from me, and that it turned out to be the thing that made everything possible." He turned the book over in his hands. "Everyone else who came expected something. Expected me to be sociable, expected warmth, expected me to be different. You came expecting nothing except the work." "I came expecting wages," she confirmed. "And because you expected nothing," he said, with the patient, concentrated thought of someone working through something to its true bottom, "I was able to, there was room for me to find my way to you, without feeling like I was failing constantly at something I couldn't do." She set down the mending and looked at him. "I should have told you that sooner," he said. "I've wanted to say it properly for a while. You didn't demand anything from me, and that was what I needed, and I never want you to think I took that for granted." "Silas," she said gently, "I know you didn't do it as a strategy," he said. "I know you just that's who you are, but it changed everything. You changed everything, just by being here and being what you are." She looked at the man across the fire, the man she had come to, carrying nothing, in a prairie town in autumn 7 years ago, who had been described to her as closed and cold and unreachable, who had turned out to be none of those things, who had turned out to be exactly the kind of man a woman could build a life beside, once the right conditions existed for him to be that man. "I know I was not easy at the beginning," he said. "You were exactly as easy as you were able to be," she said. "That was enough." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, lit by the fire and by everything that was in them, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was one of the better things she had done with her life. "Come and sit over here," he said. She gathered up her mending and moved to the settee they had brought from town the previous year, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him in the firelight with the mending in her lap and the sleeping house around them and the wide Kansas sky outside full of winter stars. And that was how they stayed until the fire burned to embers, talking sometimes and silent sometimes. In the easy warmth of two people who had found their way to each other by an unexpected road and had no intention of being anywhere else. The land in spring smelled different from any other kind of land, she always thought. It came up green and certain, and it made the distance look possible rather than daunting. And when the morning light hit the grass at the right angle, the whole world looked like a thing worth being in entirely. She stood on the porch in the April morning of 1887 with a cup of coffee, watching Silas and James. James was 6 now, tall and serious, and devoted to his father with the complete uncritical love of a child who has chosen his hero, and considered the matter settled, walking the fence line of the east pasture, Silas pointing at something, James looking where he pointed with the concentrated attention of a boy being shown something that mattered. Henry came out and stood beside her, 2 years old and sturdy and already deeply social in the way that was going to make him everyone's friend for the rest of his life, and pressed himself against her leg and looked out at the pasture with the comfortable confidence of a small person who knows exactly where he is and that it is the right place. "Papa," Henry announced, pointing. "Yes," she said, "Papa and James." "James," Henry repeated with great satisfaction. She picked him up and held him against her hip and drank her coffee and watched the man and the boy in the morning light on the grass that was greening up fast in the April warmth. And she thought, with the full and unhurried attention of someone not going anywhere and not needing to, that this was the life she had ridden toward on a hired rig on an October afternoon with 3 warnings and a carpetbag, and that it had turned out to be, in every essential way, exactly the right life. Not because it was easy. Not because she had found a man without difficulty or complication. Not because everything had been handed to her, or because the world had been particularly generous with the cards it dealt, but because she had come without pretense and stayed without strategy, and given the man the simple, radical gift of being seen as he was and found sufficient, and he had come toward her out of the walls he had lived in for so long in the only way a person like him could. Slowly, reluctantly, seriously, and then completely, in the manner of someone who, once they have decided to trust a thing, trusts it with everything they have. He found his way back to the porch eventually, with James running ahead and ducking inside for breakfast, and he came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her and took the coffee from her hand and had a drink of it and handed it back, which was a habit they had developed that she found, for reasons she could not entirely account for, one of the most intimate things between them. "The east fence is holding well," he said. "Good," she said. He looked out at the pasture, and then at her with that direct, settled look that was the furthest thing in the world from the blankness she had first arrived to, the look of a man who has found his way home and knows it with every cell. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. And the spring light poured across the Kansas prairie, and the grass moved in the clean, warm wind, and the children's voices sounded from inside the house, where Rosa was already at the stove, and the smell of coffee and cornmeal came through the open door, and Silas Dawson stood on his porch beside his wife in the morning light with everything he had ever built solid and present around him. And he was, without qualification or exception or any remaining wall to hide behind, exactly where he was supposed to be.